A fishing trawler found it first, slicing through the gray, unforgiving waters off the Irish coast. It was a silhouette against the fog, a ghost ship drifting aimlessly. They hailed it over the radio. Silence. They sounded their horn. Only the cry of gulls answered. This was the Sea Serpent, an exploration vessel that had set sail from Galway 2 months prior. Its mission was legendary and suicidal. They were hunting for a phantom, an island known as Hy-Brasil, a land said to appear from the mist only once every 7 years, a place of impossible riches and eternal youth, a fairy tale. But the ship was very real, and as the fishermen drew closer, a cold dread settled over them. The sails were shredded, hanging like skeletal remains. The deck was empty, utterly, unnaturally empty. They boarded with caution. The silence was the first thing that struck them. It wasn't just quiet. It was a dead, heavy silence, the kind that presses in on you. A rope creaked rhythmically against the mast. A door below deck banged open and shut with the rocking of the waves. This wasn't the scene of a storm. Ropes were still coiled neatly. The lifeboats were all present, still lashed to their davits. There was no sign of a struggle. No splintered wood, no bloodstains. It was an abandonment, a mass disappearance in the middle of a calm sea. 30 men had signed the roster, 30 experienced sailors, hardened explorers, and 1 young cartographer convinced he had solved an ancient puzzle. Their leader, Captain Evian, was a man obsessed, a sailor who had spent his life chasing whispers and myths. This was to be his final, crowning achievement. His first mate, Cormac, was a skeptic, a man who believed only in the sea and the steel of his ship. He signed on for the pay, calling it a fool's errand. They were all gone, vanished as if they had never existed. Down in the galley, the mystery deepened into horror. Plates of food were left on the table, a meal interrupted. A pipe, half-smoked, rested next to a book. In the navigation room, charts were spread out, covered in frantic calculations. They showed a course leading directly into a vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic. A blank spot on the map where nothing should exist. But the crew didn't flee. They didn't abandon ship. It was as if they simply evaporated. One moment they were there, and the next they were part of the fog. The captain's log was found open on his desk. Most of the pages were a swollen, useless pulp, the ink blurred into nothing by seawater. But the final few entries were protected. The handwriting started firm and clear, but quickly devolved into a panicked scrawl. The first readable entry said, "The fog is wrong. It doesn't roll, it watches. The sea has gone silent." The next, dated 2 days later, "The men hear whispers. They say the island is calling to them. Cormac thinks it's madness. I think he's afraid." The final entry, written with a shaking hand, was just 3 words. 3 words that have haunted maritime historians for a century. The fog has eyes. 30 men sailed into a myth and were never seen again. Their ship returned, but their stories did not. This mystery has no official answer. It's a story that sailors whisper, a warning about chasing legends into the dark corners of the map. The case file remains open, a chilling testament to the unknown. To join us as we uncover more cases that defy all logic, you need to subscribe to the channel right now. Don't miss a single piece of the puzzle. Now, to understand how 30 men can be erased from existence, we have to look at their first and most fatal mistake. They didn't trust science. They trusted a story. Their commander, Alistair Finch, was a man possessed. He wasn't leading an expedition. He was chasing a fever dream. The source of this fever was a piece of yellowed parchment. It wasn't a naval chart. It was a drawing, a fantasy sketched by a dying sailor who swore he'd seen it. The phantom island of Hy-Brasil, an island of impossible green hills and rivers of gold, an island that appears only once every 7 years, a ghost on the horizon. Alistair would stand on the deck for hours, the parchment shaking in his hand, ignoring the sea, ignoring his men. He saw only the island. He promised them glory. He promised them wealth beyond imagination. "A single handful of soil from that shore," he'd roar, "will buy you a kingdom." And his 30 men, their pockets empty and their futures bleak, chose to believe him. They were men running from debt, the law, or just the crushing boredom of their own lives. His first mate, Corbin, saw the madness clearly. He confronted Alistair in his cabin, slamming a real Admiralty chart onto the table. "This is reality, Alistair." Corbin's voice was low, urgent. "There is nothing out there. The currents are treacherous. The weather is a killer. We're sailing into a grave." Alistair didn't even look at the chart. He tapped his finger on the fantasy drawing. "This is destiny, Corbin. The Admiralty is run by cowards who fear what they can't measure. This map was paid for in blood. That makes it more real than any line drawn by a man in an office." Corbin tried to reason with the crew. He cornered them in the galley, on the deck. "He's leading you to your deaths for a children's story." But Alistair's poison was already in their veins. They looked at Corbin with suspicion. They saw a man trying to steal their fortune. The dream was more powerful than the truth. This fatal belief infected every decision. They loaded the ship, the Stargazer, for a victory parade, not a war for survival. Crate after crate was hauled aboard. Heavy cameras with fragile glass plates to document their triumph. Polished brass barometers to measure the air of a new world. Delicate chronometers to map the impossible. They packed equipment for scientists, not for sailors facing the abyss. They forgot the most important things. The ship's stores were a joke. Barely enough hardtack and salted beef for 3 weeks. The water casks were not properly sealed. The medical chest was a disgrace, containing little more than bandages and a few bottles of laudanum. No extra sails for when the Atlantic shredded theirs. No spare timber for a broken mast. They were preparing for the prize at the end, without respecting the brutal battle to get there. Every pound of scientific gear was a pound of food they didn't have. Every moment spent polishing brass was a moment not spent checking the rigging. They were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. For 3 days, the sea played along. It was a cruel deception. The sun was warm. The winds were fair. The crew was drunk on confidence. They sang shanties, their voices echoing over the calm water. They polished the instruments they would never get to use. Alistair stood at the prow, a conquering hero. His fantasy map held out like a holy text. Corbin stayed in the shadows, sharpening his knife, his face a mask of grim certainty. He was just waiting. And then, on the 4th morning, the trap snapped shut. It didn't start with a storm. It started with silence. A wall of fog rose from the water. It wasn't the clean white fog of the coast. It was a sickly green-gray color, thick as mud. It crawled over the waves, a living thing. It clawed at the ship, wrapping its tendrils around the masts. The world disappeared. The ship was no longer in the ocean. It was in a green tomb. The temperature plummeted. Men who were sweating moments before were now shivering, their breath turning to mist. The fog smelled of wet stone and ancient decay. It coated every surface with a slick, cold dampness. Ropes became slimy to the touch. It muffled all sound. The creak of the ship, the cries of the gulls, the voices of the men, all were swallowed by the oppressive silence. And then the final law of their world broke. A man near the helm screamed. Not a word, just a raw sound of terror. Everyone turned. The ship's compass, their only guide, their only connection to reality, was spinning. The needle wasn't just confused, it was whirling in a frantic, useless dance, a blur of brass and magnetic paint. It was pointing everywhere and nowhere at once. Panic erupted. One man fell to his knees and began to pray. Another laughed, a high, unhinged sound that was quickly choked off by the fog. They were blind, they were lost, and they had done it to themselves. Alistair stared at it, a flicker of doubt finally crossing his face. Corbin just watched him, his expression cold. The game was over. The nightmare had begun. Corbin didn't flinch. He walked to the spinning compass and placed a hand on the glass, a strange, serene smile on his face. "It's the island," he said, his voice cutting through the rising panic like a blade. "It feels us. The old world's rules are breaking." He looked at the terrified faces around him. "It's a welcome." Alistair grabbed his arm, his knuckles white. "There is no island, Corbin. We're lost." But his voice was thin, swallowed by the fog and the rising murmur of the crew. They weren't listening to the voice of reason anymore. They were listening to the man who offered them a miracle. So they drifted. The fog was a prison without walls. It stole the sun, the moon, the stars. It stole the very concept of time. Was it day? Was it night? They ate when their stomachs screamed. They slept when exhaustion simply took them, collapsing where they stood. And then the whispers grew bolder. They started using familiar voices. A man would whip his head around, swearing he heard his wife calling his name, just on the edge of hearing. Another heard his dead father scolding him for his failure. The paranoia festered. Two men drew knives in the gloom, each accusing the other of mocking him in a low voice. They had to be pulled apart, their eyes wild with a terror that had nothing to do with each other. The fog was inside their heads now. The young sailor who screamed about shadows on the water, before he vanished, he had used a nail to scratch a shape into the wooden deck. A tall, impossibly thin figure with too many joints in its limbs. They tried to scrub it away, but the image was burned into their minds. They started seeing it in the corner of their eyes, a flicker of impossible movement in the dense gray. The social contract was next to break. A man named Thomas, a big, quiet man, suddenly roared. He held up a half-eaten piece of hardtack. "This is mine! Who took the other half?" He accused a younger boy, Finn, who swore he hadn't touched it. Thomas lunged, pinning Finn against the mast, his thumbs pressing into the boy's throat. Alistair had to slam the butt of his pistol into Thomas's temple to make him let go. Thomas collapsed, weeping. Finn just stared, his face a mask of pure fear. The crew watched. No one helped. They just watched, their eyes calculating. Corbin's power grew with every new horror. He would stand at the bow for hours, his arms outstretched, talking to the mist as if it were a congregation. One afternoon he called everyone to look. A shape in the fog vaguely resembled a mountain peak. "A sign!" Corbin shouted, his voice ringing with triumph. "The island shows itself to the faithful. We are close." A ragged, desperate cheer went up from the men. They saw what they wanted to see. They believed what they needed to believe. Alistair saw only fog. Then came the sickness. It wasn't just a fever, it was a plague of the mind. It started with a shiver, a deep cold that came from the bones. Then the fire. Men thrashed in their hammocks, their skin burning, their eyes wide with visions. They spoke to ghosts. One described in perfect, horrifying detail a city of green glass beneath the waves. Another clawed at his own face, screaming about insects crawling under his skin. They lost 3 men in 2 days. They didn't have the strength to bury them at sea. The bodies lay wrapped in sailcloth on the deck, a constant rotting reminder of their failure. The smell of death mixed with the salt and the damp. It was the smell of their tomb. The cracking of the axe on the last water barrel was the sound of their last hope shattering. Precious, life-giving water soaked the deck and was gone. The man who did it just laughed, a dry, rattling sound, before collapsing. Alistair, his face a gaunt mask of desperation, finally cornered Corbin by the useless helm. His voice was a raw whisper. "This has to stop. We turn back. We pray we find a shipping lane." Corbin looked at him, not with anger, but with a chilling, profound pity. "Turn back to what, Alistair? To the world that forgot us? There is no back. There is only the path forward. The island is testing us. It's burning away our weakness, our doubt. It's a crucible. Only the strong will be worthy to set foot on its shores." Alistair grabbed the front of Corbin's coat. "You are killing these men." Corbin slowly, deliberately, peeled Alistair's fingers away. "No," he said softly, his eyes boring into Alistair's. "I am saving them. You are the one who wants to lead them back to nothing. I offer them a kingdom." Alistair looked past him at the hollowed-out faces of the remaining crew. They weren't sailors. They were disciples of a madman. And Alistair knew, with a certainty that froze his blood, that to stop this, words were no longer enough. He would have to break them. Or be broken himself. Alistair moved. His hand went to the pistol hoisted at his belt. The click of the hammer being pulled back was unnaturally loud in the dead air, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the fog. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a declaration of war. "This is over, Corbin," Alistair said, his voice level, cold, carrying across the deck. "I am taking back this ship." For a moment, there was absolute silence. The gaunt faces of the crew turned from Corbin to Alistair, their eyes like black pits in skeletal faces. They were a jury of the damned, and he could see the verdict in their hollow stares before a word was spoken. Corbin didn't move. He simply smiled, a slow, knowing curl of his lips. "With what army, Captain?" He gestured to the men around him, a broken collection of believers. "These men don't follow your maps anymore. Your science has failed them. They follow a promise." Corbin turned his back on Alistair, a gesture of supreme confidence, addressing the crew directly. His voice was hypnotic, a balm on their raw nerves. "He offers you a slow death by thirst. He offers you the empty sea that has already swallowed our friends. He offers you failure, a return to a world that has already forgotten you." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting them remember the taste of brackish water and the faces of the dead. "I offer you land. I offer you salvation. Who do you trust? The man whose charts have led us to this hell, or the man who speaks the island's will?" Alistair raised the pistol, aiming it not at Corbin, but at the sky. His authority was evaporating with every word Corbin spoke. "I am giving one final order. We will attempt to rig a new sail. We will head east. We will pray for a current. Any man who tries to stop us will be dealt with as a mutineer." 3 men, their faces etched with a desperate final hope, moved to stand behind Alistair. It was a pathetic little group. The loyalists, the sane. One of them, a man named Gareth, spoke up, his voice cracking but firm. "He's right. This is suicide. We are following a ghost story to our graves." Corbin's smile vanished. His face became a mask of cold fury. "Seize the heretics," he commanded. The word hung in the air. Then chaos. It wasn't a battle. It was a dogfight. Thomas, the man Alistair had subdued before, was the first to charge. He roared, a mindless beast, and lunged not at Alistair but at Gareth. They went down in a tangle of limbs, a fist cracking against a jaw. Gareth tried to fight back, but Thomas was stronger, fueled by a terrifying certainty, his eyes wide and unblinking as he slammed Gareth's head against the deck again and again. Alistair fired his pistol into the air. The bang was deafening, a thunderclap in their silent world. It shocked everyone into a half-second of stillness. "Stop!" Alistair yelled, but it was too late. Corbin pointed a trembling finger at Alistair. "He is the false prophet! The island rejects him! Take him!" Corbin's followers surged forward. They were a wave of desperation and madness. They didn't have weapons. They were the weapons. They used fists, teeth, boots. A man with a wild beard, whose name they'd forgotten, snatched a heavy wooden belaying pin from the railing. He swung it wildly, catching one of Alistair's men in the side of the head. The man dropped without a sound, a crumpled heap on the deck, a dark stain spreading beneath him like a shadow. Alistair was swarmed. A hand clawed at his face, nails digging into his skin. Another grabbed his pistol arm, twisting it viciously. The weight of 3, then 4 men bore him down. The deck smelled of rot and blood. He slammed the butt of the pistol into a man's ribs, hearing a crack and a grunt of pain. But another took his place, biting at his arm like a rabid animal. They dragged him down to the wet, rotting wood. Through the tangle of bodies, he saw Corbin standing over him, his eyes alight with a chilling, messianic triumph. "You see, Alistair?" Corbin said, his voice calm amidst the grunts and screams of the fight. "They don't want to be saved. They want to believe." One of Corbin's men wrenched the pistol from Alistair's hand. He held it up like a holy relic, a symbol of the old power now broken. The fight was over in less than a minute. Alistair and his 2 remaining conscious followers were dragged to the stern of the ship. They were tied to the rear mast with thick, coarse rope that bit into their skin, scraping it raw with every movement. The mutiny was complete. Corbin took a knife from his belt. He knelt and carved a deep, jagged line into the deck planks. The sound of the blade scraping wood was the only sound, a surgical cut dividing their world. "This is the border," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "Between the faithful and the damned. Between Hy-Brasil and the world of men. No one was to cross it. The ship was now a fractured kingdom floating through purgatory. Corbin and his disciples controlled the front. Alistair and the broken loyalists were prisoners at the back, left with nothing but the sight of their endless wake and the sounds of their new masters. Corbin walked to the bow, ignoring the groans of the injured. He raised his hands to the fog as if embracing a god. The island demanded a sacrifice. It demanded a test of faith, and we have passed. It has purged the doubters. Soon we will be welcomed. Soon we will be home." A weak, hoarse cheer rose from his followers. They were no longer a crew. They were a cult, and he was their prophet. Alistair watched, the rough rope cutting into his wrists. He looked at the faces of the men who had just beaten him. Their eyes were hollow, but they burned with a terrifying fire. He had tried to lead them with reason, with maps and compasses. Corbin led them with madness, and madness had won. The ship drifted on, its 2 kings staring at each other across a deck stained with their own blood, waiting for a shore that might not even exist. The ship drifted on, its 2 kings staring at each other across a deck stained with their own blood, waiting for a shore that might not even exist. The hours that followed were worse than the fight. A thick, unnatural silence fell over the vessel. Men who had just tried to kill each other now sat slumped against the rails, their eyes empty, the fire gone. They were just husks, animated by hunger and fear. The fog was a wall, a cage. It muffled the world, leaving only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the gentle, mocking lap of water against the hull. Alistair, his wrists raw and bleeding from the ropes, watched Corbin. The mutineer wasn't celebrating. He was pacing the deck, a caged animal, his eyes scanning the impenetrable gray. He was a king with no kingdom, a prophet with no promised land. The victory had cost them everything. They had traded a leader they could understand for a madman they couldn't predict. Suddenly, Corbin stopped. He froze, his head cocked to the side as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. His body began to tremble, then convulse. He fell to his knees, hands clawing at his temples. "It's there!" he screamed, a raw, guttural sound that ripped through the silence. He pointed a shaking finger into the void. "The towers! The light! Can't you see it?" The men scrambled to their feet. They rushed to the rail, desperate for a sign, for any reason to believe. They stared into the same endless shifting mist. They saw nothing. But Corbin's certainty was a force of nature. It was a disease. "It's calling to us," he whispered, his eyes wide with a terrifying, ecstatic light. One of the men, a young sailor named Finn, squinted. I think I see it," he stammered. It was a lie, a desperate, pathetic lie. But it was all they had. Another man nodded. "Yes, a shoreline." Soon a chorus of liars was echoing across the deck, a shared delusion to keep the final darkness at bay. Energized by his vision, Corbin was a man possessed. "The boats! Lower the boats!" he roared. The crew moved with a clumsy, frantic energy. They fumbled with ropes, their hands shaking with cold and exhaustion. They were lowering 2 longboats into a black, still sea. The water was like oil, unnaturally calm. It felt wrong, like they were preparing their own coffins. Corbin cut Alistair's bonds with a jagged knife. "You will row," he hissed, his face inches from Alistair's. "You will bear witness." There was no fight left in Alistair. What was the point? To die alone on this ghost ship, or to die with them in the fog? It was the same end. He was the last one into the longboat. He took one final look back at the asterisk street. Brendan, their last connection to the world of maps and reason as it was swallowed by the mist. They rode into nothing. The main ship vanished in seconds. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of 10 oars dipping into the cold, dead sea. Corbin was at the prow of the first boat, a wild grin on his face, shouting directions that made no sense. They were following the commands of a lunatic into a blank page. Then the sound started, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the water, through the wood of the boat, and into their bones. The men stopped rowing. The sound was everywhere, and nowhere at once. "What is that?" someone whispered. Before anyone could answer, a bell tolled. A single, clear, mournful chime cutting through the fog ahead. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through them. A church? A harbor? They started rowing again with a new, desperate strength. They were rowing towards the bell. It tolled again, but this time the sound came from behind them. They stopped, confused. Panic began to set in. They had lost their bearings. Alistair's boat was adrift. They called out for Corbin's boat. No answer. Only the bell, tolling again, now from their left. It was toying with them. A man in their boat started to laugh, a high, thin sound that shattered the tension before it broke into a sob. They were utterly, completely lost. From the fog ahead, where Corbin's boat should have been, they heard a single, piercing scream. It was cut short, and then the silence returned. The bell was gone, the humming was gone, there was only the fog. 3 months later, a Norwegian whaling ship, the Hrafna, found the St. Brendan drifting aimlessly in the North Atlantic, hundreds of miles from its last known position. The whalers boarded it, expecting to find bodies. They found nothing. It was a ghost ship, perfectly preserved in the cold sea air. A plate with a half-eaten moldy biscuit sat on the galley table. Tools were laid out on the deck as if the crew had simply vanished mid-task. In the captain's cabin, they found the logbook. The final entry was in Alistair's hand, the writing shaky and smudged. Corbin sees the land. The men see it now, too. They hear a bell. I hear only the sea. We are rowing into the fog. We are rowing into nothing. May God have mercy on our souls. The official report called it a tragedy at sea, but the logbook tells a different story. A story of madness winning. So who was right? Alistair, the man of reason who would have led them home to die, or Corbin, the madman who led them to a ghost island that consumes all who find it? Whose side were you on? The commander or the mutineer? Comment below. And if you want to explore more mysteries that defy all logic, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation.